Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and welcome to another pod shoot. And I'm very happy to be having this conversation today with Casey Mulligan. Casey Mulligan and I, as you see, in honor of Casey, and maybe some in my own honor, I'm advertising the University of Chicago. Uh, you know, uh, I only went there. Casey not only went there, but he also had enough credentials to actually teach there. Even though I have been invited back to give some lectures, mostly on Bitcoin. Um, and Casey is a professor of economics, and he had served as the chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He also was a visiting professor at Harvard University, and he's affiliated with the National Bureau of Economic Research and the George C. Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State. Which, as we all know, if you went to Chicago, is there should be no relationship between the economy and the state. So it should be the separation of the economy from the state. Um, uh, Casey, I remember my first day when I got to University of Chicago and checked into my dorm. Uh, I was doing a little search on where I had, prior to this conversation with you, on the status of the places I lived at when I was on campus. Because the first 3 years I lived on campus, my first year I lived at Pierce Tower, which I see has been demolished. My second year I was at Blackstone, which I think has been demolished. My third year was at the Shoreland Hall, which I don't know what purpose it's being used now, and if that's also been demolished. So it seems maybe all trace of my existence at Chicago have been demolished. But I remember when I walked into the University of Chicago and I went into my first day in Pierce Tower, and I go into this the little coffee shop there, and I see these letters on the coffee shop, and it's Tonstoffel. So I'm looking at Tonstoffel, and I said, I never heard of this word before. What does it mean? So I asked one of the people, what does Tonstoffel mean? And Tonstoffel means there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So that's the first lesson you get into Chicago, that free lunches, don't exist. Uh, Now getting into the topic that we're talking about, international trade and the discussion upon tariffs, essentially tariffs are being promoted as essentially a free lunch. So actually maybe even better than a free lunch. So and one of the things that among the several books that you wrote, and let me advertise some of your books first before I turn this over the conversation to you. One is you did write a book about your experience working at the Council of Economic Advisors called You're Hired. That was during the Trump administration. You did write what I think are probably the best books on the economic consequences of what's called Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. One was the side effects and complications, and the redistribution recession. I think that they were great books, and I read them both. And I think maybe the most important book that you've been involved in author, which I think is one of the legacies of the University of Chicago, is the book on Chicago price theory, which is one of the things that makes Chicago such a unique experience. Is the work on that of Chicago price theory. So why don't we get into the topic of tariffs? Is it also your favorite word in the English language? Has tariffs replaced Tonstoffel at the University of Chicago? And could you talk to us about your perception of tariffs? And I don't want to say tariff is just a policy as advocated by what Trump is talking about. I think also the Biden administration has basically maintained, in many cases, expanded the tariff policy of the Trump administration. So I'll turn it over to you, Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. It was fun to hear. It brings back memories too of being a student in those different dorms. I believe Shoreland's been sold, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's not a dorm anymore. And so my book, You're Hired, there's a chapter in there called I'm a Tariff Man. So he wasn't pretending to be anything he wasn't. the rhetoric has changed now to that's my favorite word in the dictionary, except maybe faith and love. I think the exact quote. So he wants everyone to know or think at least that he loves tariffs. And I think there's a few things going on there. Now, of course, tariffs are a tax on a certain type of transaction, namely where it originates outside the country. And, it has all the usual properties of taxes. Ironically, when the Trump tariffs were coming on in 2018, there were a lot of people modeling the effects of it. You might say the damage from it. Throughout Washington and around the country, actually the biggest estimates were in-house. the ones that I had in-house were the biggest estimates. A lot of Trump's so-called opponents had laughably small estimates. In fact, Trump laughed at such estimates. They had this vision where, well, you put on a tariff in a world that has no other taxes of any kind. And my model is every tax goes on top of taxes we already have, goes on top of regulations we already have. That's my model of regulation. I had one model, used it for all these policies. So we had quite big damage estimates, if you will, of what tariffs would do in their role as a tax on certain type of transaction. And they the other side that's been argued is that there's some kind of international policy benefit outside the realm of economics, perhaps, or protecting property rights of our own citizens, intellectual property especially, which is a big industry. And in the book, I remind us of the Ronald Reagan years, where Ronald Reagan was dealing with some of the same problems. Japan wasn't honoring copyrights. The East Asian tigers weren't. How do you deal with that? I don't think we should send in the military, but I'll admit it's not my field. What are you going to do to get them to respect our property rights? Reagan threatened tariffs. And there was a battle throughout his first term. He did not secure victory, Reagan, in his first term, but by his second term, he got copyright and other trademark provisions put in around Japan and some of its neighbors. I saw a lot of parallels with the China situation, although China is not a democracy and there's some military concerns with that. It looked to me like that was a path that was being sought in the first term, threaten tariffs, follow through on some of those threats, and get some agreements in a second term, which hasn't come yet and may never come. We'll know in a few weeks here. Then the third element of it is protecting special interests. Again, this was Ronald Reagan was doing that. All the presidents in my lifetime have done that, probably in your lifetime. They had special interests that were going to get protection. Ronald Reagan campaigned in Michigan. He promised the people of Michigan he would protect the auto industry. He promised the people of Michigan and others, when he was in Michigan, he promised he would protect the Jones Act. A terrible, infinite tariff policy, really. It's a quota of zero. Thou shalt have no imported cabotage. So there's that protectionism element. And then another question that I look at really since I've left. When I was there, I just had the model I described. But since I left, I said, well, if we're going to have protectionism, there are different forms of protectionism. And I think it's fairly clear quotas are worse protectionism than tariffs. And the reason being, the consumer suffers either way. But with the tariff, at least we get the revenue. With the quota, the foreign companies get the revenue. And you saw Ronald Reagan doing quotas all the time. Japanese coming in to the White House saying, please give us a quota. And Ronald Reagan saying, yeah, I'll kill two birds with one stone. Michigan will be happy and Japanese companies will be happy. And we saw Biden do that. He turned the European, I believe it was steel tariffs or some kind of metal tariffs that Trump had, and he turned them into quotas. And then they ran a big press event and they said the trade war is over. Of course it's over. The European companies are celebrating with some great profits. So those are kind of the three elements I think you want to look at to understand and what's going on and maybe predict what will happen next.
Yeah, I think, as if I recall, and maybe these were reports written by you or Thomas, on the reports, but I remember reading a report, and as I get older, my memory gets less reliable. But I remember there was a report where there was a comparison between the incidence of the let's say anti-trade policies, whether they be tariff of quotas of the Trump administration and the Reagan administration. And if you put rhetoric aside, if you look at the record of the Trump administration, from the consequences of its policy and its tariff regime, and compared that to Ronald Reagan's record of tariffs and quotas, that if you had a double-blind experiment, then the result would be that the Trump administration was a more pro-free trade than the Reagan administration. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, you're describing the tariff man chapter of my book, and
Yes.
Yeah, it's fairly accurate. Now, as we discussed, the Trump didn't get a second term yet, and he did not secure intellectual property protections yet from China, and Reagan did. So if at the end of the day those protections haven't been attained from China, then I got to chalk that as a win for Reagan in terms of promoting American interest in trade vis-a-vis China, at least. The other part that I think Trump will win on is the Jones Act. Trump is the only president who did not, during the campaign, go straight to the Seafarers Union and say, I will protect the Jones Act, which says you cannot have a foreign company or foreign crews moving materials between two U.S. points in the U.S. So that Texas can't ship natural gas to New England on a foreign vessel or with foreign crews. And by the way, there's no American vessel to do it. So Texas cannot send natural gas to New England, as an example.
What do you think? Do you think that a zero tariff policy? Do you think that the best thing we got to figure out who do you want to benefit? Supposedly, in Chicago price theory, it's consumer welfare is the objective function we're maximizing, and given the fact that we're really maximizing, consumer welfare, and we could talk more deeply about how you define that, but essentially from that perspective, shouldn't our tariff policy, or absence of a tariff policy and absence of a quota policy, be completely independent of whatever other country does with respect to their own trade policy?
Well, how are you going to secure those property rights? Send in the military? You have some other method? That's outside my range of expertise. I don't know how to convince countries to do things in our interest. But that's really our interest. And I do know historically that's the approach that Reagan took: tariff threats, and he did some actual tariffs, I believe, on Japanese motorcycles and a few things like that.
So, but do you think, in the absence of being able to extract something of value that is worth more than a tariff, is there any other reason to justify doing a tariff except as bargaining strategy to get something in return?
No, I don't see anything. Not knowing the fine contours of geopolitics, if we just stipulate there aren't any large geopolitical rewards to be had, then yeah, you're not going to want to do it from the average consumer welfare point of view. Now, if you're putting more weight on Michigan or some Pennsylvania, that's of course a different question. But
yeah, so
the average consumer welfare point of view.
Yeah, that's pandering and cronyism, which is not capitalism. So if you're a pure capitalist and you're looking and you're ignoring, political economics, but you want to be a purist about your approach, to economics, in my opinion, and you might have a different opinion, and if there were no geopolitical concerns or any political concerns, and it was just pure economics, I believe, and maybe you can agree disagree with it, that an absence of tariffs, is the best policy, and if other countries adopt, restrictive trade policies, the only people they're really adversely impacting are their own consumers.
Well, that would be the primary Depends on, on the cost situation here, but, at a constant cost, marginal cost situation, yeah, they're harming their own consumers, and not really affecting the world much else. I think that's clear. That's always the approach we took. That was my model of all the policies, and not just trading with foreigners. I mean, that's an aspect of things, but trading with each other. If we have a rule that restricts trades, and we have thousands of them between Americans, that's going to have many of the same effects and many of the same political issues. There will be special interests there. The trial lawyers will be there asking to have restrictions on contracts so that there'll be more court trials. It's a ubiquitous issue, but we know how to analyze it, and we knew how to analyze it back when you were in school. So that learning has not depreciated.
I would assume that it's that the learning with respect to the benefits of trade have been pretty well established since the writings of Adam Smith and David Ricardo on the benefits of on a freight trade and how we analyze that. As someone who has been both in the worked for a political administration and now back on campus again, from the perspective of actually having had an important role in advising an administration on economic policy, and then writing about it when you put together your annual reports. How much has it changed how you teach? Has it changed at all the perspective? What has it brought to you as a professor teaching your classes now? What insights have you gotten that have changed your approach to teaching from your experience in politics?
Yeah, there are a couple. One was it opened my eyes, and then only a year or so in advance of the rest of the country having their eyes open to really the fact that experts and technocrats, and I would be one of those, they're not accountable to the people. And that's a problem that needs some counterbalance. And elected officials is one thing we have. So when I was there, I started to realize, I'm not accountable. The technocrats before me made a lot of mistakes. And if it weren't for elected officials out there hearing from the people, we don't like being forced to buy health insurance. We don't like this and we don't like that. We got a fentanyl crisis. The technocrats would just totally ignore it. So, you get frustrated with some of the elected officials don't have the training that I have. And they say things that don't make a lot of economic sense, but on the other hand, they're accountable. So I really found them as partners. And I view that going forward. The other thing that I've learned really is what the government's actually doing. The government is massive. Nobody can understand the whole government. Not myself, and there's nobody. It's just too massive. And so in academia, when we talk about government and public policy, of course, we're interested in that as a topic. A lot of that discussion and analysis and publishing has very little to do with what the government actually does. And so my eyes were open on the type of data sets to use and ways to better understand, knowing I'll never fully understand what the government's actually doing, to get a kind of better handle on that. So, and that's kind of brought me more toward regulatory policy, because that has so many moving pieces. And so I do a lot of teaching on that. And the students are fascinated because we talk about regulations they've never heard of and aren't mentioned in any of the other classes, but they can be important.
Can you mention some of the regulations that you find particularly absurd that you think people are not aware of that you might want to share with the people watching us now or who might watch us later?
Well, I can give some specifics and I give some buckets. So one bucket I mentioned, trial lawyers. There's a lot of restrictions on contracts between two businesses, between workers and employers, between a business and its customers. It's all for the trial lawyers, and they make things expensive. And basically, they say you shouldn't have mediation. If anybody's been through a divorce, I'm sorry, but you probably realize they try to encourage mediation to keep a lot of these disputes out of courts. It's just better for everybody. But there's so many transactions where that's not allowed, and the trial lawyers are right there. asking for that, and they are granted it. And many administrations have granted that. So that would be an example. Price controls. Now, we've heard of price controls. We tend to think of like the grocery price controls or somehow price control where the final consumer is there and maybe getting a perceived benefit. But there are a lot of price controls that are just between business to business price controls. And there's no rationale of the sort that says, well, one party's not real smart, and we benevolent government are protecting that party by regulating the prices. No, you have two smart, massive companies, and one of them's got better influence with the government, so they pass, a regulation that says, there's a limit on what my counterparty, another massive company, can charge me. So net neutrality would be like that. That'd be one you've heard of. Restricting what different technology companies can charge each other and how. The rebate rule was a rule in pharmaceutical supply chain and what type of deals manufacturers can have with insurance companies. Again, pairs of massive companies. Terrible rule. One of the worst regulations I've seen in terms of aggregate expense. And you got lots of other, smaller ones that don't make the radar, but they fit into some buckets like that.
Now, I remember one of the pledges that Trump made when he was elected was with respect to not only deregulating but creating a disincentive for new regulation by having to terminate certain regulations and in some ratio. I don't know if it was 2 to 1. I don't remember what it was. So that anyone who wanted to do some other one regulation had to figure out ways of removing a couple of regulations in return for the regulation they wanted to get on. So were you involved in those efforts with respect to the deregulation push at the beginning of the administration?
Not in the beginning. I'm a huge admirer. Jeffrey Rosen is an attorney who led a lot of that. He had done some scholarship around what's called a regulatory budget. So that's the term for what you described, tracking the regulation and having a budget. It's a little hard for me to believe that there wasn't regulatory budgets. In fact, they're fairly rare internationally. And you go back 12 years, there was no regulatory budgets. That, of course, when you run a company, you're running companies, you just don't tell your subordinates, go maximize profits. I don't care how much you spend. You give them a budget and say, do good things with this budget. And if it turns out it's not enough, then you come back with your hat in hand to me, the boss, and you explain why you need more budget. And that's the basic principle in regulatory budgeting. You have all these agencies and say, look, here's a limit on how much cost you can incur from the people's perspective. And, if that's not enough, come back to the president and tell him why you need more. The technocrats are outraged by this. How dare you put us under a budget? We're always doing good, and you're just limiting our ability to do good.
Well, they always say they're always doing good, but they don't measure how much good they're really doing, and they don't measure how much it costs for them to do what they claim is doing good.
Yep, that's a hypocrisy, big time. So now the budget, there have been a number of budgets around the world, some Canadian provinces, for example, that are the type of just counting the regulations. Look, if you put one in, you need to take one out. It's a great communication tool. So that was part of our regulatory budget. But we had the other part that would really look more like the company budget, which is in terms of dollar costs. So you couldn't game it. Sometimes to jack up their stats, we would see an agency, when they take out a regulation, they'd make they take it out in eighths, and then they'd get an 8 count for eliminating one regulation. But that didn't help them on the dollars and cents, because if you just take out an eighth of the regulation, you're only taking out of the eighth of the costs, and then you end up in the same place. But for communication purposes, that 2-for-1 seemed to work pretty well. And I think that's why other governments are exploring that and sometimes implementing that too.
Well, as someone as I am, that you might not be aware of, but some of the people who have watched me now a few times, probably understand now that I'm a self-described anarcho-capitalist. So I don't find any reason for government's existence. That doesn't mean I don't believe in governance. I believe people can opt into governance regimes that they found will make their lives better off, but they should also be able to opt out and opt out without any consequence. So, if I opt out of being a citizen of the United States, there's a consequence. There's a tax penalty associated with attempting to opt out, and it's a pretty substantive tax penalty. So you're locked in, and it's not easy to opt out. So I think there should be a lot of competition for everything, including countries people choose to be a citizen in. So, but given the fact that government exists and given the fact that regulation exists, if you take like the model that some people want to do with climate change and set climate objectives on carbon content or whatever people want to measure, and they have a carbon neutral society, and then price out carbon credits. Can we use the same somewhat analogy for if we cap the economic value of regulation and then basically create a market for whoever suffers the most from the regulation might be willing to buy regulatory credits from somebody that suffers less from it, so that we can then now find out that to the extent that regulation exists, that the people where the cost of regulation is the highest would be the most incentive to buy credit from people where the cost of complying with regulation is less, and that we might get then a more market-based allocation of minimizing the burden of regulation and minimizing the total absolute amount of regulation. Has there been any discussion of trying to take that approach to government regulation?
We have that approach in the single biggest regulation that we have out of thousands. So it's not a large share, but it's the single biggest, would be automobile manufacturing regulation around emissions, or you can think of it in terms of fuel economy. They're technically different regulations, but they're the same thing. And the EPA during Obama implemented a credit system. So Tesla, I don't know about at the moment, for many years, they made most of their money selling credits to other companies.
Yes.
And in a way, that's a beautiful thing for the reason you describe. Another thing, I was able to use it to see, well, what does it cost to comply? Apparently it costs that much because there are companies like Honda who would buy these credits rather than trying to make their autos comply directly. It was costing hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2 abated. And Obama himself said CO2 abatement's only worth $50. So, we're way overpaying. So it has that additional kind of transparency element. Now, nobody talks about it, but it's there for anyone who wants to see. And we did a little report on that in the economic report of the president.
Why in many of these issues, why aren't we not seeing more public debate on? I mean, there are a lot of us economists out there, and there are a lot of economists that, whether they disagree in the role of government and where government should intervene and not intervene, supposedly, economics is a profession where, the concept of efficiency is an important concept, and also incentives are important. And I don't know how many schools of economic thought basically say efficiency and incentives are completely irrelevant. So to the extent that almost all economists universally agree that efficiency and incentives, are important objectives, maybe people can argue over how important they are relative to distribution and allocational concerns, so that's a different issue that can be discussed. But within the context that there's a generally universal agreement that they are important, how come why are people not more outspoken with respect to like poor mechanism design, and just an inefficient way of accomplishing things from an economic perspective that maybe there's reasonably broad agreement that people think are good things, to accomplish. I mean, we're certainly far from, one of the I haven't been, the only time I went to Chicago besides the time I gave lectures was when I went to celebrate Ronald Coase's 100th birthday. So, we're very far from a Coasean world. How do the economics profession get us closer to, a Coasian world?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we're not accountable. It's not just economists, but technocrats writ large. We're not accountable. So we can kind of wander off in a direction. Most of my reward within the profession would be coming from other economists, And so if it's cool to do a certain thing and think a certain way, there's incentives, individual incentives to align with that. And then it's not a real awareness. I remember when we were in the White House and fact checker would fact check and he would call up experts, And I said, can we at least have a rule that when an expert's going to opine on one of our policies that they've actually read the policy? And the fact checker said, no way, I'm never going to be able to find an expert to comment. The individual incentives to understand what the government is doing is quite low. And that would, of course, be a leading reason why we want to keep things out of government into organizations that are more responsive to its members. And people can leave those organizations, and then the organizations like, okay, we better treat people well. Government doesn't have to do that. It can treat people quite badly. They don't have a lot of choice.
So how do you think we can effectively begin to shrink government so we can have government focus on the few things it might not do as badly as it does other things, given the fact that I think government does everything badly, but at least the things government does less badly than other things, or where maybe people might argue that that there's a large collective action problem, and the transaction cost associated with solving that collective action problem makes sense then for it to be centralized in government rather than decentralized. Again, I don't believe with this stuff, but I know there are many arguments of people who do believe in this stuff. So how could we have how can we educate the American people more so they have a greater degree of economic literacy, so we enhance the economic, right now, essentially a $35 trillion, deficit is a free lunch. So right now at $200 trillion, right now we're being told that there's a $200 trillion hole of unfunded liabilities. Every year, the Medicare Trust Fund and Social Security Trust Fund puts out a report that says we're going insolvent. I mean, insolvent doesn't mean that they have zero value. It means that they don't have enough value to pay 100 cents on the dollar. So that's our definition of insolvency, is they can't pay all their liabilities at par. So they've announced it for years and people ignore it. And people say, I'm going to preserve all your benefits by doing absolutely nothing. So, but doing absolutely nothing guarantees that the Medicare trust funds will go insolvent, and what can we do to have, where unfortunately, we mask everything, in my opinion, with debt. So people think there's this free lunch associated with spending other people's money that they never have to pay back, and maybe nobody will ever have to pay back. And again, it's this illusion going back to what I learned my first day at entering Piers Towers. There aren't anything such thing as a free lunch, and it seems like every day the political class is trying to sell us that what I walked in that one day at Chicago and saw that sign. They're trying to tell us that I just was misinformed. I should have gone to Harvard, or some other school where teaches that free lunches are readily available, as opposed to a Chicago price theory class, which basically reinforces the idea that free lunches don't exist at all. So having approach of being an author of Chicago price theory, probably the most solid foundation, in my opinion, of that is the basis. That's the foundation for all economic work, is price theory. So given the fact that that's the foundation for all economic analysis, is what can we do as a society to get ourselves more informed so that people understand the trade-offs involved in decision, and understand the concept that every decision has trade-offs, and how to begin for each individual to understand how to calculate for these decisions opportunity costs.
Well, actually, the pandemic helped. Teaching opportunity cost was a challenge for my whole career until we had the pandemic. Now every student understands opportunity costs because of that. But more broadly, there was this debate, and I don't know where I come down between Stigler and Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman thought that economic education was very important. He wrote the books and the Free to Choose TV show. If he was in a taxi, he was going to give a lesson to the taxi driver. And Stigler was more of the view, that's not so important. It's the special interests who kind of drive these narratives, and the special interests know well what they're doing. And I think there's some of each. And one thing I've come to admire quite a bit is the federalist system that we have in the United States, the laboratories of democracy, if you want to use that phrase, that different states can do different things, and people can have some mobility. A lot of people moving to Florida these days, and Texas. Mm-hmm. And that can be a way for people to realize they don't have to understand how to run the government, but they can realize, look, that this package they have over in the state is pretty good, and people move there. And then the other states are like, if we want to retrain people, I guess we better do at least as good a job as Florida or Texas or whoever the attracting region is. Now, some of the issues you mentioned, like the national debt, are by definition a national issue, but there is some scope to push things out to the states and keep them out of the federal government. And we have a constitution that does help with that a bit.
Yeah, and the thing, this is an argument I had with Friedman, and his support for, I one is being someone who doesn't believe in legal tender laws. I was never a supporter of the Fed, but when I did have conversations with Milton about the advocacy for an independent Fed, I told him I would prefer. To me, that at least a politicized Fed, at least there's a governance, at least there's accountability, but an independent Fed ultimately has no accountability, and so I had preferred, even though studies have shown that inflation has been lower with independent Feds than political Feds, but who knows if we ever would have seen the type of actions we saw with the bailouts the Fed has provided if it required congressional approval to do those things. Would Congress have ever agreed? And there might have been a public debate, because then there would have been an explicit cost associated with it, rather than the Fed going out and printing money and giving it out and converting Wall Street firms into bank holding companies and giving them access to the discount window. And all the things they did in 2007, 2008. So, so I don't support central banking. I don't support fiat paper money. Milton did, but Milton always said, that whatever you subsidize, you get more of, and the Fed essentially subsidizes government debt. So, I actually gave a talk at Chicago in front of Friedman, where I called him maybe one of the worst macroeconomists of the 20th century. So, since he might have been the biggest advocate of big government, because he was the most important advocate for a central bank that subsidized government spending through money printing. So, he wasn't very happy with my talk, but and later I think he had some regrets, because he had advocated that maybe monetary policy should be like automated by a computer, so they would limit the discretion of the Fed. But so it seems to me that really most of the economists support policies of support, and who claim to be advocates of limited government, but they actually support subsidizing government debt. And therefore, how come they don't understand the inconsistency between supporting the subsidizing of government borrowing money and the consequence that that'll result in getting more government spending and more government?
Yeah, there's another element to that. Let me add. I have a lot of sympathy for what you said, but let me add. We say the Fed is actually a bundle of activities, and the monetary policy is a small part. Since my first class, I would invite my students. I say, go downtown and stand on the sidewalk in front of the Chicago Fed building, look up at that massive building. They don't need all those people for monetary policy. They're doing something else, and that gets ignored due to the shiny object of monetary policy. A lot of bank regulation. Back in the days when I was first teaching the class, and when you were a student, there would also be more mundane things like check clearing going on there.
Right.
But they're not accountable for all that stuff because they have this shiny object. And the other thing I would point out is, like, this is government run. So guess what? There's going to be no technological progress in money because the government hates technological progress. Not our government in particular, but that's the nature of central planning. You do not change anything. It's hard enough to repeat what you did yesterday, let alone try something new. And at the time, I couldn't imagine, what would this new money look like? But I did know that innovation that's going to be an opportunity cost of having the Fed run things. And I think it's clear now in what you've engaged in that there is an opportunity cost, and there's other ways for the monetary system to work, and innovation is possible there and not being realized due to government regulation.
Yeah. I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes. I'll share a couple of others, things that I've been personally involved in and that you might find useful for your classroom. One is when I was, a friend of mine had a bankrupt, about to go bankrupt foundry, a steel foundry that was located in Iowa. So he called me up and he said, please help me, Jeff. So I said, okay. And I did it as a favor to a friend. So, I'm flying out to Iowa, really not easy to get there. And so, my first meeting to meet with the foundry was represented by the United Steelworkers Union, the local chapter of that. And so I'm sitting at a table with about 18 people who are the negotiating committee and the local members of the United Steelworkers Union who are overseeing the process. So I said, this is not going to be a normal negotiation. I'm going to explain certain things to you. So the first thing is I calculated for the business, economic value added. So I don't know if you know the concept of economic value added, where you're basically calculating is a business earning an economic return above its cost of capital. So I demonstrated to them that every day they come to work, they're actually destroying value for the people who are paying them to show up for work. And so I said, why do you think people should come up and pay you money when you're destroying value for them? So that kind of opened their eyes to get a sense of, why is anybody continuing to pay you to come to office anyway to work? Because every day you show up, you're actually making people poorer. So who are the people writing the checks to pay your salary? So they were very surprised at how much value destruction they were causing the owners of the business. So I said, you ought to take a different perspective of what you think about the owners, because you should understand that how much they're subsidizing you, because they keep paying you while you keep destroying value for them. So the guy from the United Steelworks was completely lost, but I explained it really simply. I went through one full day of explaining them, showing them how to calculate economic value added. So, and they understood it, the way I laid it out for them. And then I said to them, many of them are you're complaining that you're not getting raises, and the reality is you are getting a raise. The company's paying you money, is paying you more money. The problem is that the government is taking more of your money away from you because you have all these benefits that are mandated, and the cost of these mandated benefits keep going up and up and up. So the government, the company would rather pay you the money and not rather than pay you money and manage all these package of mandated benefits. They'd rather just give you the money. So I did a calculation of really not how much money they received. I went through a calculation of how much it cost them, how much the company was paying to have them on the payroll, because that's the cost to the company of that individual. So I was letting them know this is the cost to the company of you being here. So every year, you're getting a big raise. You're not seeing it, but their congressman was Dick Gephardt. So I said, to the extent that you're not unhappy with your wages, don't talk to the company. Complain to Dick Gephardt. He's your problem, not the company. So, at the end, I had made such a, at least a presentation they found compelling, and I was taking away compensation, so they were having to make big concessions. This is not about a negotiating of a reduction of increases, a lower increase. This was a reduction of wages, reduction of benefits, them contributing more to their health care plans, having an elimination of their dental plan, and having their pension plan converted from, a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan. So this was an expensive package for them. But, at the end, when I got through with them, I told them ultimately the people you got to blame, are called Dick Gephardt. He's the problem, not the people owning the business. They're the solution. They're the ones who keep hoping that the situation will get better, and they're willing to continue to pay you, a paycheck, until until then hopefully the business improves while you're busy destroying value for them. So, so basically you're destroying value for the owners of the business. The government is destroying value to you. And the only one helping you are the people telling you that they're really sorry that they have to, do these things. But if I'm not telling you you should accept this, I'm telling you you should do what's in your best interest. And if you have a better offer on the table, don't take this. So I'm not trying to convince you to accept this deal. I'm trying to explain to you why this is the best deal you're going to get from here. And, so at the end, the guy from the United Steelworkers Union contacted me and he said, that's a very compelling, presentation. I hope you don't represent any other companies in negotiations, because you actually convinced everybody in the room that the owners were good people, and some of them actually did go out and contact Dick Gephardt as a result of it. And they were not happy with the type of explanation he gave. So, and they said, they said, where did I get this logic from? I said, very simple. I learned how to think this way at the University of Chicago. So I think, that's why I'm wearing the hat and the sweatshirt and love to speak with people at the university, because that's a discipline of thought processes that you get studying at the University of Chicago. And its roots to me is the work on price theory. So the other experience I had is a friend of mine was on the board of a bank. The bank got sanctioned by the OCC. It was a small bank, and they got sanctioned. They were put on a formal agreement. And so, first thing, and I don't know how much you know about this, other people, when a bank, basically there's a huge information asymmetry in the banking industry, right? So, basically those that provide, uncollateralized debt basically understand they're giving to banks too big to fail, and they don't really take seriously that they're not going to get paid 100 cents on the dollar, because historically they've always been bailed out, and their expectation is that they will continue to always be bailed out. So there's a complete absence of market discipline. So all relying upon other regulators at the Fed. So the OCC comes in, and I would meet people from the OCC. So I would sit with the people from the Office of Control of Currency who were responsible for auditing this bank. And they would go through this process of going through, appraisals. They wanted to see all appraisal-based loans, and they wanted to go through the loans based upon how the bank chose its appraisers to make sure there was no conflict of interest in the relationship between the bank and the appraiser. So they wanted to see a rotation in the process. At the end, they never even read the appraisals, okay? They just wanted to make sure that appraisal existed. So every time, so the first meetings I came in, and this was also very strange to the OCC, is so I'm sitting down with the guy who's in charge of, the relationship with this bank, and I took out the loan, and I went through the loans that had the most absurd appraisals, in the sense of their appraisals were so far above the economic reality of the underlying credit. So the government was basically grading these loans as having much better quality than the loans really had. So, which was weird to them, because people argue about, you graded this too low, and they want a higher rating, so they need less capital. But I took the loans that had, the worst rating on the opposite side, which should not be the incentive. But I did it to point out to them, when I told them, I said, think about how stupid your job is. You're coming in here, you're doing an appraisals. You're curious at how we have this financial crisis after 2000, 2008. And I'm showing you, you look at these appraisals, and these appraisals are so absurd, and they're so ridiculous, and there's no basis in reality. And you don't even really care what the appraisal says. You just care who hired, how the appraiser was hired. Then when you go to the reports that the OCC does when they go in and they do an inspection, they can write a report basically saying all these bankers are, and in this case, they did basically accuse the CEO of the bank of being a criminal. They practically accused him of that, and that the lending team was completely incompetent. So they're producing this work, but who has access to it? The only people that have access to it are the members of the board of the bank. Otherwise, the public doesn't. So the public doesn't get to see, here I have this bank. We're going in on behalf of the public, to figure out, is this bank healthy? We really don't know if it's healthy. We know they're appraising loans the way they should be appraised, but are these really good loans or bad loans? No, we don't know because we're not really looking at the appraisals. But we do know one thing: the people who are granting these loans are not very bright. They don't really know how to measure credit. And the CEO, we can't prove it, but we see enough evidence that probably, there's tremendous conflicts of interest, and it was, when I went into the bank and, from the people sent me in, the first thing I did is I went to the how much, what on certificates of deposit, who got rates that were unusually high relative to what the banks were giving to anyone else. I assumed all those people who got above market CD rates were the friends of the CEO. And then I went to see about their loans, and they also were the loans that got the best loan forgiveness. So the people who were getting the best rates were people who had the most attractive loan forbearance terms. And in addition to that, they were getting an additional subsidy of getting significantly above market interest rates. And the regulators can't do anything about this. They can't even tell the public about this. So think about the fact is there's no monitor inside these producing information. So think about how poorly as a society we allocate capital because we have no incentive to have any discipline in who we give this to. So, I would hope some of these things maybe people at Chicago will teach. I don't think many other places will. But hopefully these are anecdotes if you end up working back in another administration that you can take a look at some of these issues.
Yeah, those are good stories, and they're not atypical, I'm afraid.
Yes. So how can we make them more rare? What do you think that we can do to make these things more rare? I mean, maybe it's getting more people to read your book on price theory.
The bailout problem. I mean, you're right. That's where it starts. And how can we make everybody understand we're not going to bail out again and really live up to it? They're not going to understand it unless we really can live up to it, and that's the challenge. I don't know that's been cracked yet.
And overall, if you have an opportunity of being back in Washington, would you look forward to having that experience again?
If I could be helpful, Bush asked me twice, and it didn't go both times. I didn't feel I was very supportive. He wanted to privatize Social Security. I saw real problems with that. Same this time. When I went to the Trump administration, it was clear they were deregulating. It was going to lower prices, increase efficiency, and all kinds of things. It was clear to see how I could support that. And so I'll wait to see what they have going on. Now, from what I can tell on the campaign trail, they're continue to be interested in deregulation. And the table's kind of set because Biden has put in so many regulations, and so they need to be taken out. So I could easily see supporting that type of effort if that's what his team wants to be done.
So the issue of deregulating is something that you really would like to be focused on doing. If you have that's where you think you can contribute value to, is going back and continuing the work that was done in the first Trump administration.
Right, and I'm not going to be good at supporting regulating. The special interests want that. So, I'm going to have to assess. First, we see who wins, but we're going to have to assess, what is the direction with regulation.
And I'm curious about why you were against the privatization of Social Security. Now, I'll tell you this: the advice I gave the Reagan administration when actually Milton Friedman had recommended me to give some advice to the Reagan administration, and one of the things I suggested, and I was a 24-year-old person at the time, I at that point in time, when we had people were pessimistic. I don't know if you recall, because I'm older than you, that Tobin's Q, or the relationship of the market value of the stock to replacement cost. The stock market at that time was priced at like 35%, of replacement cost. It was the biggest discount since the Depression. So, basically, when almost every industry is significantly under Tobin's Q, there's no incentive to reinvest in property, plant, equipment, and expansion of a business, or R&D. The best thing is just to give people back the money and slowly go out of business. So, until it gets to a point where you can actually, earn your cost of capital again. So with the government, many people were then skeptical. And I basically I spoke to some political people who did like a survey, and they found that many people were willing to take, they'd rather have basically a small payment today, because they were so skeptical that they would receive Social Security benefits, that the advice I gave to the administration was that they should just pay, they should just announce a price at which, people could basically take money today in return for, ceding the right to make any claims for Social Security checks. And I basically found that the price that you could almost basically pay off any claims to Social Security with a small amount of money, because people were so skeptical at the time. So I was told that was not politically feasible. So some people thought it was a clever idea, but nobody was willing to advocate on its behalf.
Now, the military did that. In fact, the military did what you described about that time. I don't know the exact history. They bought out a lot of military pensions with an upfront payment. And,
interesting.
And the payment was kind of on the low side.
So maybe that was an application of my suggestion. I don't know. So I didn't really hang around very much, but there's been the idea.
There's been suggestions around Medicare as well. I mean, there you have double the opportunity. Not only that people might be more interested in the upfront part, but also, they're more interested in the cash than all the, stuff that comes attached to Medicare cash. Medicare being the health program. That type of privatization, I think, is very much worth pursuing. But what Bush was proposing was to force people to have more money taken out of their check and put into some kind of fidelity account. And to me, that was it's less freedom.
Yes. But Fidelity might have liked it a lot.
Yeah, Fidelity liked it, and then you get into government management of the pensions. Huge mess here in Illinois. I mean, a lot of the blue states, government's got its nose in the private pensions, and they'll try to steer the investments to the politically favorable. You know what? Rod Blagojevich got in trouble for some of that type of stuff, and it's one reason we have a one-party state now, that the businesses dare not speak out against the party, capital P, because they can steer these investment funds, in another direction. So those are things I'm very cautious about. And the Bush people were of a sentiment to way oversell that scheme that they called privatization.
So that just sounded like another crony scheme to help some special interests, and I'm glad that you didn't help, because no scheme should be coercive in nature. It should be voluntary in nature. So it's because people believe that they're better off by the trade rather than doing a trade because they're forced to do it without, and they basically have a gun put to their head. So we should be given options, and our options should be expanded. They should not be limited and reinforced through force. So I'm glad that well, that's something I would expect from University of Chicago is that never a big fan of doing much, if anything, through coercion.
Now, did you take any Lester Towser classes?
Yes, I took Telser and Peltzman.
Okay.
I actually didn't show up for any classes because I was trading. So
I
when
see.
I got to Chicago in '74, in the beginning of '75, I bought a seat on the CBOE. I leased a seat on the Board of Trade in the Merck, and every day at 15, when I was 15 in 1971, and I took my bar mitzvah money and my savings bonds that were giving me at birth. I had $5,000. Stockbroker explained, with the help of somebody who helped guide me, that I could buy on margin a 2-to-1. So basically, somebody suggested a specific. I wanted to bet on gold, and I asked someone for advice if gold is going to go up. What's the bet? What's the most leveraged bet? I didn't say it that articulately, but that was the point I made was, what is going to go up more than anything else with somebody who's willing to lose everything, because I was willing to lose everything, but I wanted to make as much as I could. And so, I bought a gold, someone pointed out a gold stock. I bought the gold stock on margin. Somebody helped me do all this. And my $5,000 was over 200,000 when I got to Chicago. So I decided that I wanted to spend my time trading. And for me, '70s was an easy time to make money, because I just bet on inflation. So I just plunged into leveraged bets on inflation. So by the time I got out of Chicago, I was worth over $10 million. So starting with that money. So I was not interested in going to class. I was interested in making money, but I wanted to graduate. So I did spend time speaking with teachers when they had office hours and trying to understand what the material I needed to know just to make sure I passed and moved on. And I did have a very particular interest in contingent claims pricing. So I started taking classes in stochastic calculus. But one of the professors I really liked, who I actually showed up for a couple of his classes, was Yale Brosen. I don't know if you remember the name Yale Brosen, but he taught like industrial organization, and he was very much against any sort of antitrust policies. So I found him, really, stimulating. And I was also very curious about, rational expectations. So I spent some time with Lucas, discussing, issues like money neutrality and rational expectations. So I was interested, mostly in that. And then I got exposed more to Hayek, who was not there at Chicago, but I began in communication with him because I was provided an introduction by Friedman actually to Hayek, and I got my eyes open to Coase, and so I think these people ended up becoming great influences for me, and Fisher Black, who had just left Chicago. So that was my intellectual interests. I thought it was but yes, Telser and many people, I did spend time with them. Peltzman, sometimes we played basketball together in the gym. It was a great experience, and I think that was kind of one of the golden eras for Chicago, because that's when almost the entire faculty was committed to a classical liberalism that I don't think exists today at Chicago. I think that there's from what I see, there's a greater advocacy, for a greater role of government in economic policy.
Now, Towser, probably a bit after you graduated, but his work very much congruent with what you expressed today around the idea of choosing your own regime, joining groups, leaving groups. That in economics we call that the theory of the core,
Yes.
and that's your way of thinking. So you might enjoy revisiting some of Lester's books around the core, which he started out more in pure IO, but I think after you graduated, he was doing the more general way of thinking around the core, and understanding that applies not just to companies, it applies to families and politics and government, and it's the right way of thinking, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a strong advocate of it, and I appreciate you, reminding me of Telsa, because I think right after I get through with this conversation with you, I'm going to now check what books on Telsa I should get and reread them, because while I didn't attend class, I did read a lot. So I loved reading, and then I loved having access to the professors to be able to ask them questions on things that I might needed help in understanding, and I had a lot of questions. So I think a guy that you probably know or friendly with, who was one of the nicest people I met at Chicago, and really who was really insightful to me, was Ed Lazier. So
Oh yeah.
Ed was a good friend. I actually, when I built my first company, I put him on the advisory board of my first company, a risk management company, and Ed asked me, why are you putting me on the advisory board? I'm not an expert in this area of risk management. And I said, you ask such great questions that every time I speak with you, I'm a lot smarter. So it's not that you have to know a field. If I begin explaining to you stuff, the way your mind works, you're always going to start asking a lot of questions. And just the questions you ask, you're going to ask a lot of questions I won't have the answers to, but that'll provoke me to try and figure out the answers. And so that's what I really, appreciated, about Ed. He was just such a nice guy. And he was really very helpful for me, from that perspective, that he would spend a lot of time with me. And, maybe he thought I was worth the time. But he just asked a lot of great questions and opened my eyes to a lot of things I probably would never have opened my eyes to if he didn't ask those questions. He had such a great curiosity and sort to understanding of that. Did you get an opportunity to spend much time with Ed?
Yeah, he was an advocate of mine from when I was an assistant professor. And then he was one of the Bush people who asked me to come to the White House. And I ended up saying no. But as you know, he worked for Bush CEA chair.
Yes.
For Bush after Bernanke. Bernanke was the first one who asked me. And then when Eddie got that job, he asked me.
Yes, wonderful guy. So I have great, I said the only brand I will ever promote is the University of Chicago. I will never wear anything that promotes any other brand, other than the University of Chicago. So Casey, I don't know, for the people that are listening or anything, what are the takeaways that you would like to have? What were the things that you would like to? I never like to have the last words. I like to have my guests have the last words. So what is it that you have as much time as you want to talk about anything that you want to talk about that you would like other people to have the opportunity of listening to?
Well, I think if you're following the policy area and the tariffs and everything else, you need to see what the government's actually doing. New York Times is not going to tell you. It's very much a narrative there. Wall Street Journal editorial page, pretty good, but you need to understand what the government is actually doing. Maybe a chance to make a profit when you know that, but certainly to understand, the directions that our government's taking us, the different actors involved are taking us. There's a lot of untold stories about our government.
So, making that comment that provokes a question on my part, what would be the sources for the average voter who might be reasonably intelligent and has some curiosity, that when people are talking about economic policy and What do you think are the best source material for somebody who doesn't have, you know, training in economics? I won't say professional training because I don't think many economists are actually professional. But so no offense, but but for those that that like to dabble, they want to know, they want to be informed. There's a limited amount of time to actually read stuff because people are about living their lives. So what do you think for the average person, the average consumer of economic news, outside of the Wall Street journals, especially their op-ed page, where do you think the other best materials that people could go to have a better understanding and more solid and not so much based upon propaganda and a bias?
Wall Street Journal editorial page comes to the top of my mind. I mean, I listen to it in the car a lot. I mean, they have a listen to the editorial page button, and it takes you right through. And they're surprisingly well versed in the different policies. And a lot of the policies we talked about today, the net neutrality, the details of the tariffs and the quotas. And then often they link to other sources that are reliable. And health is a major area. Our government has got more than $1 trillion a year it's spending on health. Paragon Institute is something that I follow. They have a lot of good accessible reports, and you might run across them in the Wall Street Journal editorial page because they have people from there. Wall Street Journal will have people from there every once in a while publish something, some new horror about Obamacare. They'll have the Paragon guy, write 600 words about it, and then you can follow up, on the Paragon website with their longer type of piece.
That's well. So everyone should be reading the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal every single day. So that's one thing. If people want to be economically literate, and that's maybe for the average person, the best place to go to is for knowledge, and then for learning a little bit more about the health sector, which is such a large component of our GDP. They should go to this Paragon. What was again? Paragon?
It's called the Paragon Institute.
The Paragon Institute is where they should go to. So for general economic policy, Wall Street Journal op-ed page. For healthcare policy, the Paragon Institute.
Well, let me mention the
Sure.
It's another format. It's also very easy to consume. The Committee to Unleash Prosperity. You can go to unleashprosperity.com. They have a daily hotline. And a lot of times they'll have things a day or two ahead of the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal subscribes to that hotline, and so do Sean Hannity and different newscasters. On radio, they subscribe to the daily hotlines. They have 5 items a day. 1 paragraph each. The top things you want to know but you hadn't heard.
So it's unleashprosperity.com.
Yes.
I'm going to check that out. I never know that existed.
I thought you were on the list. Wish you would get you on the list. It's a great resource.
Well, thank you. I would leave. So unleashprosperity.com. We'll also make sure that people know that they should take a look at
and they put it in email format. So once you can go there to sign up, but once you're signed up, it just comes in your inbox every day. And I read it every day, especially this last year when so many things are happening so fast. It's such a convenient resource to stay abreast on interesting things.
I want to ask you, sorry, one other question, if you don't mind. Are you working on are you still doing any academic research, and what research that may, if you are, and are you contemplating or active currently writing another book?
Well, the Chicago Price Theory, I keep saying this for about 2 or 3 years now. We're close to having a second edition, which has several more chapters. Part of the delay, other than the usual Murphy's Law sort of thing, is a number of the chapters are being published. So I published 2 or 3 of the chapters in Public Choice. At the time, I just viewed it as a chapter, and then I thought, whoa, maybe this is an academic article, and I sent it, and they loved it. One of them was accepted in 1 day, which is unheard of. In academia, things are supposed to take years, not 1 day. I had a Journal of Political Economy article just came out this month. on using price theory to understand the market for opioids and how different groups have different fatality rates and have changed over time. I had a piece in the Journal of Law and Economics about regulation. There's an issue in honor of Peltzman. I think it was December 2022 issue of Journal of Law and Economics. So yeah, I continue to do the academic research. Price theory has, the old price theory is great, but there's things to be added, ways to do it better. One of the chapters that I wrote for Public Choice is just the Coase theorem. I'm not rediscovering the Coase theorem, but a much easier way to communicate it, a much easier way to make it a quantitative exercise. So I continue to do that kind of work. That's why if I don't end up in government, I don't got a problem, because I have a great time at the University of Chicago. They're great people, great students, and the research part is a lot of fun as well.
I spoke with yesterday a libertarian law professor, and one of the things he's working on now with respect to things that he thinks that libertarians need to give greater thought to, and so I don't know how you as an economist might think about this. Is he's concerned about the concentration of political power in the hands of these big tech companies, and how that might have an adverse consequence on economic competition. So I guess to some extent we're going to get to see how Lina Khan and her days might be numbered, but with respect to the Google trial, in the sense of is there now too much corporate power? And if there is, how you counter that. I know at the Chicago publication that I get from the booth every day, there are a lot of topics about people writing about growing corporate power and are these market failures that the government needs to intervene on. What do you think about that conversation?
Yeah, what I can tell you a story. One day I was going to Kudlow's house and Kudlow's office in the West Wing, and it wasn't really scheduled. I just said I want to check in with him, and he had Bill Gates there. And Bill Gates was talking to Kudlow and the staff, and I stayed and listened. Gates was saying how one of the regrets he has, looking at this next generation of tech people, the Zuckerbergs and so on, he's like, I never had Microsoft didn't have a Washington office, and that was a mistake. And now he sees the next generation understands they need to have influence. When we the Trump administration got in, there's a bunch of Google people at Federal Communications Commission. That's one of the reasons you had the net neutrality and a lot of the things around that. It was very much favored Google over its wannabe competitors in various dimensions. So that's the companies are entwined in the government. Also, the auto regulations. I mean, the auto companies are right there. With the pen, so that, I don't know that some of my colleagues propose government solutions to this problem. I'm not sure that'll just make it worse, but there's no doubt the companies are part of the government.
Yes. So, but ultimately, it's the government that's facilitating them to have more market power than the market price would have in the absence of government assistance. So really, it's not the company's not the problem; it's their influence over the government that's the problem. And if there was not a central authority with that type of power, who could allocate benefits and privileges and perks, then you're subject to just market discipline. And clearly, the fact that there's so much effort in lobbying is because there's such a high return associated with the effort of lobbying. And for me, I've always said this people should realize how perverse government is, because if you take a look at all the dollars that companies invest in lobbying, many companies invest more in lobbying than R&D. So many companies determine the best investment they have is in influencing regulation, rather than trying to figure out how to run better operation, because there's a higher return to investing in government lobbying. It's an easier way to make money than figuring out how to be better at your business. So how to deter entry gives a higher return, or create barriers to entry, or have a special relationship, on no bid contracts or whatever, and that gives you, much better returns, than hiring the best people, figuring out how to run. That's hard. This is easy, and that's pretty perverse. And the fact that more and more money is going into lobbying, and more people, and the fact that as a society we're allocating more and more capital to political influence, should be an indication of how high the returns are associated with political influence, and to the extent that those returns come at a cost to somebody. So maybe that's a good. I had somebody I knew headed up this institute in Mexico a while ago when it first got founded, called IMCO, was Institute Mexicano for Competitiveness, and basically, I told them that one of the things they should calculate, is pardon the expression, I said you should calculate a how Mexicans are fucked index. And you could basically calculate all the regulations, how much it increased the cost to the consumer, and actually which of the companies are responsible for those regulations, and how much cost they add unnecessarily to the cost of the life of the citizen Mexican. He liked the idea. The board of directors of the institute who were funding it, they didn't like the idea very much. But maybe if we had more transparency, with respect to the cost of these regulations, and who benefits from them. I don't know really who really is producing that work, because unfortunately, even most of the think tanks and the organizations that are founded that support, they get supported by companies, and those companies want to use them, have these to influence perks that they want to get from the government. Almost nobody is promoting the concept of no perks from government. It's being able to influence the perks that they find good for them, and discourage the perks that they have no skin in the game with, and eliminate those perks. So I don't know if that's a good. I don't know how easy for you it would be to get the data, and maybe some people could have put a book together in an index of how much a consumer gets screwed every day because of the government regulations, and who are the people who are the beneficiaries of them, and then maybe society would be armed with more elements to understand is that who's most successful influencing policy, to extract economic rent for themselves. We have the concept of economic rent, but we don't really have necessarily a lot of information about how much economic rent is being extracted and who are the biggest beneficiaries of that. What do you think about that?
The regulatory budget helped a lot with that. Now, that was on a flow. That didn't deal with regulations that have been there for a long time, but any new ones coming in or going out were going in the regulatory budget. And then we had a website to go with that budget where you could see what parties met with the government or sent comments into the government about that. And you see the usual suspect. We had Obamacare regulation or deregulation. There would be the hospital union, would be there, and that sort of thing. So you can get that information, although the regulatory budget was wiped away when Biden came in. But we wanted to have it set up that way.
Well, hopefully with the new administration, whichever administration is that they will be as transparent as you apparently were, when you had some influence in being in government, of basically being able to measure the cost of regulation and making it available for the public to see. And unfortunately, I think many of these things are not publicized enough, so not enough people know that there are these sources that they can consult. And apparently, very little of the media seems to be encouraged to point people in this direction.
That's right. Okay, good. Thanks,
Well,
Jeffrey.
thank you very much, Casey. I hope you enjoyed this.
I did. Now, you want to talk offline a little bit? We're
Sure.
recorded now.
Yeah, I'll cut this off now.